We have Mrs. Gray, recently married, Harvard PhD, and she is, along with her husband, off they set, they go west because he has an appointment to the history faculty at the University of Chicago. He has an appointment. Her own appointment will come, as things often did at that time, a little bit later. But with that appointment, she certainly and very quickly became a beloved teacher at Chicago. Her Western Civ class was the toughest seat to get at the university. And in fact, there's someone sitting in the front row who found that out on a real-time basis. She was given tenure in 1964 and would go on to rise through the university administrative ranks. In 1972, Mrs. Gray was appointed as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern University. Now, she was the first woman to hold this position, and with any challenge and any role that Mrs. Gray took on, she was often the first woman. So I'm not going to say that anymore. Just assume that she's the trailblazer. In the mid-1970s, Mrs. Gray returned to New Haven and she became the provost of Yale University. Her husband, also a noted scholar and historian, was appointed to the history faculty at Yale. For 14 months, Mrs. Gray was the acting president of Yale University. Now, in 1978, the Grays again went west, but this time, Mrs. Gray had the appointment. For 15 years, she would serve with marked productivity and great success as the president of the University of Chicago. All during this time, and really continuing through to today, she has willingly given her time and her talent and her clear thinking to any number of organizations. They're chatting, I'm scared. She has served on the board, or actually led the boards, of Harvard, Yale, Bryn Mawr, the Smithsonian, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Marlboro Music Festival, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and yes, let's see, the American Philosophical Society. President Reagan acknowledged her hard work and her great generosity of spirit with the Liberty Medal. In 1991, Bush 1 presented Hanna Holborn Gray with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, this nation's highest civilian award. In 1993, when we were celebrating our 250th anniversary, we presented Mrs. Gray with our congressionally authorized gold Thomas Jefferson Medal for devotion to learning. Now, I have known Mrs. Gray for almost 30 years. She was elected to the society in 1981, and I came as an infant in 1989. This wonderful list of accomplishments, I think, doesn't quite reflect Mrs. Gray's great wit. She entitled her memoir, An Academic Life. Now, academic can mean that you are affiliated with an institution of higher learning, but it can also mean lacking worldliness and without practical application. This evening, with the help of Bob Hauser, we will spend much of our time discussing, most assuredly, the former definition of the word academic. And we do have Bob Hauser with us this evening. Bob is the Society's executive officer. He went to the University of Chicago, where he took an economics degree, and not Mrs. Gray's Western Civ class. He went on to take a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan and would serve for 40 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as the Vilas Research Professor in Sociology. He is one of this nation's preeminent sociologists. He focuses on healthcare and aging and education. So he retired, but was called out of retirement to become the executive director of the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education at the National Academy of Sciences, an esteemed organization to which he was elected in 1984. He then again flunked retirement and came out of retirement to take on the role of the executive officer here with us in Philadelphia in 2017, sorry. So as I ask you all to please turn off your cell phones. Yes? Good, good. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Robert M. Hauser and Hanna Holborn Gray.
Thank you. That was lovely, thank you. So, now you all know why it is such an honor, as well as I trust in anticipation, a pleasure to spend about an hour chatting with Hanna about her life and about her wonderful book. Memoir, that's the right term. So let's start at towards the beginning. Why don't you share with us some of your recollections about the migration of leading German academics to the U.S. in the mid-1930s? As we talked about it early this afternoon, you said that a lot of people seem to have forgotten about that.
Well, I think a lot of
never knew.
people have forgotten about what happened in Germany in 1933. But in any case, not people of my age, but youth. And the real story of the outflow of academic immigrants, and also so many people in the arts and film and literature and music, particularly in music, but also in the theater and in so many of the areas of the professions, journalism, law, and so on and so forth. They're better known, I think, than the academic refugees, and it all began on April 7th, 1933, when the Nazi regime issued a decree in which they fired from the civil service all Jews, with a few exceptions, and people who were, as they described it, politically unreliable. My father was politically unreliable in the extreme, and my mother was Jewish. And they saw immediately, although mixed marriages were not prohibited in 1933, they came to be criminalized in 1935. And the offspring of such unions were characterized as mischlings and had a different legal status than the Aryan children had. In any case, my parents saw very clearly, excuse me, what was coming, and my father, who was in some danger of being consigned to Dachau, which had recently opened, later, of course, primarily as a concentration camp, but initially in 1933 as a camp for political prisoners, and he was in great danger of being consigned there. He left and went to London, and later on, the family came together in 1934 and came to America. And what I remember, Bob, is the arrival in America. Now, people say you can't remember something that happened when you were 4 years old, but I do. I do because I think it's my earliest vivid memory, I'm sure of that. But also I assume because it must have been talked about a lot. So I remember standing on the deck of the SS Olympic at midnight. In those days, boats might dock at midnight on the piers in New York, and I can remember passing the Statue of Liberty and being told what it was. And I can remember standing at the rail and having my hat fly off and being sure I was going to be disciplined because that hat was never seen again. And I can remember being on the pier, and I can remember the luggage being open, and we had huge quantities of goods that we were able to bring with us. And my brother, on the top of the trunk that they opened, the first trunk they opened, were my brother's lederhosen, his German trousers, with a hole in the seat. And he burst into tears, and I remember all of that, because he thought these customs officials were police, and they were going to keep him out of America, and that he wasn't going to get in. So it was a very exciting and, in some ways, quite dreadful moment because of what he was encountering. And after that, I remember nothing at all until I woke up the next morning in New Jersey. So my knowledge of the immigration was not, of course, a deep knowledge of the terrible terrible developments that had taken place in Germany in 1933 and after, but rather I was told that we were going to America and that we were going to escape bad people. I mean, it was sort of at that level, undoubtedly, that my mind worked at that time. And so what I remember is that arrival, Bob.
So what about what would you tell us more about the overall migration of the German leading academics, intelligentsia here and
well, in 1933, immediately after the decree was issued, 16% of the German faculties were gone. Because, of course, all professors were civil servants. All academic employees were civil servants in a state system. 16% of them were gone almost immediately. And it has to be said that, by and large, their colleagues sat by in silence and did very little. They might make private gestures of sympathy or support, but there were very few supporters or people who were outspoken. The scientist Max Planck went to see Hitler, and he tried to persuade him to exempt from this decree the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Fritz Haber. And Hitler said, in response to this plea, if science requires Jews, then we will have to do without science for a few years. That was Hitler's response. And as I say, most of the colleagues sat by more or less in silence. And there's something about that that is really haunting when you think about it. So by 1940, by the time the war had started, there were probably about a little over 2,000 academic refugees in the United States. And they were in very different kinds of institutions, including, by the way, historically black colleges. Some 80 of these academic refugees taught in historically black colleges. Of course, they understood what discrimination meant, as their colleagues at the black colleges understood what discrimination meant. And it's a very interesting history there. But they went to all kinds of different institutions, city colleges, small liberal arts colleges, larger liberal arts colleges, research universities, research institutes, libraries, museums. Not all of them were able to find positions. Some of them had to work in menial jobs in order to support themselves. It was a Depression era in the United States. It was an era in which anti-Semitism was prevalent in higher education, particularly, of course, in the private institutions, the Ivy League and so on, but it existed everywhere. It permeated the system in so many ways. And there was a great fear, too, that these foreigners would come and take jobs when young Americans were not able to get them at the colleges and universities. Some were being laid off. Some faculty were finding that their compensation was being reduced. If they had the chance of staying on, they were going to be earning less. And so the refugees were certainly aware of the fact that there could be this kind of resistance in appointing them in American institutions, and that there were very few jobs.
Now, your father was an eminent academic. Hanna was Hanna Holborn, and he was among the most successful, I would guess, of these new immigrants in finding a job. It took him 6 weeks to gain an appointment in the history department at Yale. If you think about today's young scholars and how their job search looks, that's really a little different. And your mother was I guess a classicist of sort, a philologist.
She was a classical philologist.
Classical philologist. And your text shows just immense respect for both of them. I wonder if you might comment on how they developed, how they fed into your development as a learner, as a scholar, as an academic.
Well, my parents first of all, they were younger than many of the refugees. My father was only 32. My mother and father were the same age. They were only 32. And that in some ways, I think, made them much more adaptable. Also, they had been on the left in Germany. They had democratic aspirations for a German world in which the Weimar Republic was generally being opposed by a very conservative professoriate that deplored the fall of the empire and that thought of the Weimar Republic as very weak. And so they were the citizens of a republic which they hoped could be a democracy, but which they saw lacked the kind of support that might make it stable, and that lacked roots and lacked the kinds of traditions that could infuse a genuinely democratic society. They were witness to the conflicts between communists on the one hand and other parties on the others, which took the form of armed conflict. I mean, they weren't just looking at party conflict that was on the podium and on the radio and so on and so forth. They were looking at private armies hired by, led by party leaders who were fighting in the streets of the major cities and who were individuals who were informing on one another as subversives and potential traitors. And in the meantime, there were very few genuine, powerful supporters of the Weimar Republic. So one thing that was clear to my parents, as young people, as they were, was that they wanted their own universities in which they had grown up, which they had attended, and which they were now part of, to be reformed. They wanted them to be more liberal, to be less politicized, to be places that were open, and that were open to liberal ideas as well as conservative ideas, where appointments were not made on a political basis or on the basis of what particular orthodoxy you professed in your historical interpretations or in your political position. And so one thing that was clear to them was that they might find more of the kind of university that they hoped the German might transmute into in an American setting. And therefore, I think they were always extremely supportive of the American academic system and told us as children that it was, in so many ways, an outgrowth of a democratic society, and that these were institutions that one should care for greatly. And we listened to that, and we saw what kind of support they had from the system and that they committed to the system. Like all immigrant families, what they cared most about was the education of their children. And so education was absolutely everything. You had to go to the best schools and you had to do well or you were in big, big trouble. And so this notion that education was the key and the route to becoming not simply an American and an assimilated American, but a successful and satisfied member of that society and a contributing member of that society, that meant a good education. And everything was sacrificed for a good education. I went entirely to good private schools, even went to a good private college. And it was also the case that my parents, despite their strong support for the New Deal, for American democracy, for these more open kinds of institutions, were horrified by American popular culture. And the last thing they wanted their children to do was to succumb to what they thought the superficiality and materialism of American popular culture. And so as a consequence, we were very strictly brought up. We were not allowed to listen to the radio, for example, except for the New York Philharmonic, the NBC Orchestra conducted by Arturo Toscanini, and a program that appeared when nobody was listening to the radio at 12 o'clock on Sundays called the University of Chicago Round Table of the Air. This was thought to be intellectually pure and intellectually educational, obviously, for children. And so those were the three programs that I was allowed to listen to, otherwise no radio.
But you also mentioned Jack Benny And Fred Allen.
Then a wonderful thing happened. A wonderful thing happened. My father discovered the comedians. He discovered Fred Allen, and he discovered Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snerd. And he discovered Jack Benny, and all these were on Sunday evenings. And I would sneak into my father's study, and he would close the door, and we would listen to the comedians. And that gave me my first career ambition, although it was a short-lived one. Nonetheless, I thought maybe being a radio comedian would be the best of all possible worlds at some point. So that degree of American popular culture, he decided was just fine, that it was really funny and that it was really good. But if I wanted to listen to anything else, I had to go to my friends' houses. And if I wanted to do things like eat white bread or chew gum or have a peanut butter sandwich, that had to be elsewhere, and I didn't tell when I got home. And I see that a friend of mine, Mr. Haber there, is nodding his head because he grew up in the same kind of family and had the same kind of experience, clearly. And there were all kinds of rules that we had, all kinds of clothes we couldn't wear, all kinds of things we couldn't do that differentiated us from other children. But what was always impressed on us was the importance of education, and what was also always impressed on us was that we were free to read anything we chose to read, and we were free to think about anything we chose to think about, and we should be serious. And we should read the newspaper. We should know what was going on in the world. We should be aware of international developments and so on and so forth. The thing was to be serious and to understand what was really happening, but also to be open and free so far as reading and the beginnings of something like thinking went. And so I think they stimulated an interest in ideas and politics and international relations and all kinds of issues, and literature above all. At the same time, my father, who was a distinguished historian, did not make us in any way think that we had to be academics ourselves. And when I grew up, the one thing I was not going to be was an academic, because I was going to do something more interesting than all my relatives. And I was going to have a more exciting life than I thought they had. And I also, of course, was not going to meet a husband in a seminar. That was about the most unromantic thing I'd ever heard of. So how wrong can you be?
So are there other people, other individuals in your family or beyond who've had a especially great influence on you?
I think my brother had a great influence on me. We came as children, and my parents said to us that we should correct their English whenever we felt that their English was going off the rails, as it very frequently did. And they would correct our German. And this gave us a role that meant that we were proud of being bilingual. We talked German at home, mostly. And over the years, gradually came to talk some funny combination of the two. And it gave us a kind of role. And my brother and I were sort of allies in this. That is, we were together going to correct our parents' English.
I see.
And of course, we had an aunt whose English we could never correct, who used to talk about reading Shakespeare in the English translation, for example. And who, when she wanted us to get to the point, would say, "Stop running around the shrub." She was much loved for these interesting linguistic mannerisms. And in any case, we never tried to correct hers. We wouldn't have thought of it. But what that meant was that my brother was sort of an older ally, and he felt that I had to shape up. And he was sent to school, and somehow he learned English in school. By osmosis, I guess. And so he would come home and teach me. So I learned English. And then he learned how to read. So he thought he'd better teach me that. So I learned how to read. He was a sort of boy think tank. And he, very early in life, sort of seemed to know everything about politics. And as he became more American, he was one of those dreadful little boys who know all the sports stats. That is, he would know what baseball players, had had an average of something in St. Louis in 1926. Like that. But in any case, he taught me a great deal. He was a born teacher, and the consequence was that I was overqualified for first grade and had to start school in the second grade. And he really did teach me quite a lot. I mean, he not just language or how to read, but he taught me quite a lot about how to think about politics, and he understood. He understood what was happening in American politics, and he understood what happened when, I don't know, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, and I didn't understand and thought maybe the Italians should be applauded. He taught me about fascism, what it really meant. And it wasn't that my father and mother hadn't tried to explain it, but my brother could do so in terms that I could understand. So I think he was a great influence.
And of course,
on me.
he also had a very distinguished career.
Pardon?
He also had a very distinguished career.
Well, he had a career partly in politics. He was on Senator John Kennedy's staff, and then he was on the White House staff. And then he became a professor of American foreign policy at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, and continued to be a consultant and active in Washington.
So you described at length this community that was created among the Central European migrants to this country who had so much in common in terms of their academic backgrounds and orientations, and how that lasted into the second generation of which you were a part. I wonder what you think of does anything of that remain still? Is there still a kind of a community that in the third generation and beyond, or has that population just kind of been absorbed into the great maw of, as you put it, American culture?
The third generation you would not define. The second generation was not precisely a community in the way that the first generation of migrants together were, but they were recognizable as children of with many of the same experiences and with many of the same characteristics. I mean, on the one hand, we became more and more American, but we were a little different always. And whatever that difference was, we recognized. Now, I'm one of the youngest, believe it or not, of that second generation, and what that means is that there are very few of us left. That is, I'm one of the few who are still left of that generation. Just this past week, a historian of that who spanned the generations, Walter LaCour, died in Washington. He was 97 years old. He wrote a memoir called Worlds Ago, a memoir of my journeying years. And his journeying years were representative of what had happened to so many of those exiles. He went to Israel, he went to England, he went to Australia, he went to Canada. Ultimately, he came to the United States. And that experience of being an exile in more than one country was, again, representative for so many of them. Those things have changed so much. And a third generation is almost impossible, I think, to define.
You also, well, you started you referred to Walter LaCour just now. You wrote that many of the emigre scholars wrote autobiographical memoirs. Aside from that one, are there others that you would recommend?
Well, I think that one is a very
yours,
good one.
To be sure.
No. No. But that one is a very good one. LaCour was a wonderful historian, an excellent historian. A complicated man, not an easy man, and a man who actually, and this is one of the few memoirs that doesn't look at the past, where he came from, through rose-tinted glasses, and he criticizes the refugees who kept saying everything was so much better at home and everything was so much better in the old days, and Americans are so impossible, and so on and so forth. And he scolded them for that kind of attitude. He was a very positive man in his exile. Felix Gilbert, another fine historian who taught at Bryn Mawr for many years and ultimately was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, wrote a memoir called A European Past, which actually does not talk about the immigration. It talks about the Germany of his time, how he grew up, the coming of the Nazis. He talks about the experience at the University of Berlin, where he and my father were both in the same seminar at Berlin. They both had the same mentor for their PhD work. They both saw themselves as students of the same professor. And Felix Gilbert writes about a time in Germany and a family in Germany. He was a Mendelssohn. That was a very extended family, the family of the Mendelssohns. In fact, after the war, during the occupation, it was said that there were three kinds of Germans. There were Nazis, there were non-Nazis, and there were cousins of Felix Gilbert. And he wrote a very nice memoir, very late in his life, that gives you the sense of the contrast between that later life, which he kind of assumes you know about, and the life from which he came. So it's less about the immigration. George Mossey at Wisconsin.
Oh, George, sure.
You knew him?
Yes.
Well, he wrote a very fine memoir, which is a memoir that has a double theme, because George Mossey was writing not only about being a German refugee in an American university that he became totally passionate about, I think, or at least as he writes it, but he was also writing about being gay.
Yes.
And that combination in that particular memoir of what it was like to be an outsider in two senses.
And he only acknowledged that publicly quite late in his life.
And it was quite late in his life that he acknowledged it, yes. Makes it an especially interesting and often very moving one. And finally, I think I would think of Gerhard Mazur. He was a historian also, who wrote a book which unfortunately has never been translated into English, called Das Ungewissen Herz. And he was a man whose first port of call, his first exile, was in Latin America. And he ultimately, finally, because it was very difficult to get visas to come to America, and we should talk about that a little bit maybe.
Sure.
He ultimately did get a visa and came to America and had a career in American higher education and transformed himself into a Latin Americanist. Wrote a very important book on Simón Bolívar that was, I think, in its time, certainly, the sort of book on the subject. And it's a very interesting memoir indeed. His roots in Berlin, his family, then the exile in Latin America, and then the sort of reworking of his entire intellectual life and becoming a Latin Americanist and his life in America. And it's a book that I hope can get translated. I'm going to push for this.
Good. So you mentioned the issue of obtaining visas to come here. Why don't you say a bit more about how?
Well, American visas were very hard to come by for the academic refugees, and one reason they went to so many different places before they came to America, because about 50%. Let me go back for a minute. About 25 to 49% of the German professoriate went into exile. The difference is depending which university you're talking about and sometimes which disciplines you're talking about. Because, for example, universities like, say, Frankfurt, where social sciences were very prominent, as they were not at all universities, saw a larger outflow. Heidelberg saw a larger outflow. And Göttingen saw physicists leaving one after another. Whereas there were others like Marburg or Freiburg probably that saw less of an outflow. So to get a visa to go to America, you had to go through a lot of different steps. First of all, you had to get on a waiting list. And when the war began, there were 300,000 people on the waiting list. At the same time, the immigration law specified a quota of 27,597 Germans. In 1933, there were issued 1,260, something like that, visas The others went unfilled. In only 1 year of that whole period of the Nazi persecution of the German universities and of the Jewish and politically oppositional members of those universities, in only 1 year was the quota filled. And that was the year 1939 to 40. And that was after Kristallnacht that had happened, the terrible destruction, the burning and the looting and the window smashing in Berlin and elsewhere in November 1938. That woke up parts of the world that had not been awake. And that sent a lot of people scrambling who had, for many different reasons, thought they would not be immigrating from Germany, thought Hitler couldn't last, this would be over, or who couldn't confront exile, or who had all kinds of desperate commitments at home that they felt they needed to honor. For whatever reason, they were anxious to get out. And in that 1 year, the quota was filled, but of course, there were many more applicants than there could be visas. First, you had to get on the waiting list. Secondly, you had to show that you'd bought your ticket on the ocean liner to get to America. Third, you had to show that you had transit stamps from each of the countries that you would pass through to get to the boat. You had to have police records. If you'd been in the military, you had to show that you'd been honorably discharged. You had to have bank records. You had to have an inventory of your possessions, and they would decide what they would take and what you could take. You had to have a sponsor in America who would vouch that in an affidavit that he or she, but it was mostly he, would take financial responsibility for you if that became necessary, so that you would never be a charge on the taxpayer or on the state. You had to get a recommendation, and you had to get certifications from that person's bank, and that person also had to submit their tax returns in order to show that what they said about their finances was really true. You had to have medical records, police records. You had to do all this within a certain amount of time. Ultimately, what you had to do was to have an interview at the consulate, at a consulate. In our case, it was Stuttgart. And if you happen to have seen the photographs that were shown earlier, my own visa was issued in Stuttgart. Now, all this had to be within a certain time, and when you think about collecting all that stuff, it could time out and you would have to start all over again. In addition to these rather cumbersome requirements, the State Department of that era was permeated with anti-Semitism from the top down. The State Department was not interested in admitting foreign Jews. And the obstructions that could be mounted simply by delay, by saying this person is not going to be a good citizen of the United States, through some sort of thing having been left out of one of these many documents that you had to produce. They kept lots and lots of people from getting visas, and these interviews were the final things that were necessary in order to get. And in fact, the State Department was submitting false information about what was happening on the immigrant front and on this German situation to the White House. And ultimately, the Treasury Department, because of Mr. Morgenthau, made clear to the White House what was happening with the State Department. In any case, the fact is that getting a visa was a very difficult thing. And so some people were fortunate and got visas to go to Turkey, to go to Cuba, got visas to go to China. There was quite a community of academic refugees in Shanghai, for example. And Turkey was a very important location where quite a number of them went. And of course, there were people who went to Israel, quite a few, and so on. Most people, in fact, went to more than one country, and one reason for that was the difficulties of getting the visa to come to the United States. And even the British made it extremely difficult to get a visa. Anti-Semitism was prevalent there as well. The traditionalism of the universities was very great. And the cabinet, early in the 1930s, made clear that what Britain wanted were people of great prestige in the arts or in science. Otherwise, people like my father, for example, and many of his contemporaries who went to England as he did, could not stay for more than a year. Their visas could not be renewed after that. So that it was actually a way station for the majority of the academics who moved through England and came then to America. And my own father, who could not find a job in England that suited him, came looking in America because of that. Initially, they thought they would go to England and that was somehow European and it wouldn't be so far from home.
So I was going to ask about Sidwell Friends and about Bryn Mawr, two schools that the first one is one in my neighborhood in Washington, and the other one is somewhere around here. But instead, I want to ask you about a different school, about your year at Oxford, because we don't have too much time left.
I'm sorry.
And I'm especially interested in this, your comment that there you said, I first really experienced what discrimination toward women in academic life could mean. And of course, you were only about 19, 20 years old then.
Yes.
That may have been a factor as well.
I'm not sure that it was. I'm not sure that it was. I went to Oxford, and I went to an Oxford college, and it was a little bit like being back at school. In some ways, I mean, first of all, I had, believe it or not, a very good education at Bryn Mawr College.
You're free to talk about that, too.
Well, I have to be a little careful because there's some people from Bryn Mawr. And, don't want to overdo this, give them swelled heads and that sort of thing. But in any case, I went to Oxford at a time when anti-Americanism was becoming quite powerful in England, among the intellectual classes in particular. The Korean War was something that everyone disapproved of course. And it was the beginnings. It was a time when the Cold War was becoming colder. I don't think you can. Is a Cold War? Can a Cold War heat up? That's the sort of thing that was happening, and of course, both great powers were held responsible, and so the whole view of Americans was not very positive among many of the students at Oxford. But the women were particularly inexperienced even in thinking about political issues. They had grown up in a much more protected way than we had. At my Oxford college, you had to be in by 10 o'clock. 3 times a term, on application to the principal of the college, you could stay out till 11. But the principal could tell you that no, you were not allowed to stay out for that particular night. She wouldn't think of it, letting you, and so on. So it seemed to me not only that it was like a regression from the sort of freedom and self-government and independence that my college had taught, and that I had had a much better education than these British snobs thought was possible for an American. And when they thought I had had a pretty good education, they decided I was Canadian. Because Americans couldn't be cultured. In any case, the woman question at Oxford was very great. The women's colleges did not have the wealth of so many of the men's colleges. The parietal rules and the requirements surrounding women and their lives in college were extremely constricting in ways that the men's were not. Many of the male dons didn't want to teach women and made that entirely clear. You probably have heard of Hugh Trevor Roper if you've read history. I was sent to Hugh Trevor Roper. The last thing he wanted to do was to be tutor for an American girl. And then he figured out he knew who my father was, and so he became semi-polite. And it was just made clear. I mean, everything about it. Your food, your rules. You had a moral tutor who treated you sort of the way a high school counselor might have treated you. I mean, in a very nice way. But girls were simply thought to need a kind of protection, and the notion that you were there to become independent-minded and to become a critical analyst of those things about which you should be a critical analyst didn't seem to be the point for the girls. They were meant to be rather docile. Now, mind you, there were some extraordinary women. And in my own college, in the senior common room, there was Iris Murdoch, for example. And we did nothing but talk about Iris Murdoch, who was a sort of sensationally bizarre presence in our college. And there were obviously women of tremendous talent and achievement, and women of tremendous eccentricity, which meant they were also very independent. But it was not what I had thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be like Gaudy Night. And recently I reread Gaudy Night, the Dorothy Sayers novel, and I thought it was awful. I mean, the picture of the college was so awful. Why I had ever thought that a women's college at Oxford could be an extremely interesting and stimulating place, I do not know if that was Dorothy Sayers College. Nonetheless, you just had the feeling you were less welcome as a woman, that you were surrounded by a kind of protectiveness, schoolishness that you should have outgrown by the age of 19 or 20, and that you had to make your own way. You had to fight for what you got, and then you could get some very good things.
So let me ask a question about current developments in academics with a little bit of context. You said in describing the Warburg Institute in London, I guess, one learned a great deal and came to new intellectual questions merely by browsing along the shelves. I wonder what you think about the growing practice of eliminating stacks in university libraries.
I think it's terrible, the worst. Now, I'm constantly confronted now. You know, I still do some teaching, and I'm astonished by two things. One is that students seem able to read so much less. That is, they haven't been immersed in reading in the way in which I was or people like me were. They are used to reading stuff online and not on pages. They're not used to evaluating what they read online in the way in which you might have learned to evaluate what you read on paper. They haven't been, I think, taught either to write very well or to read very deeply. And libraries are places where they take their laptops. And what you see are students sitting at the reading desk working away on their laptops. Now, it's good to work away on your laptops, but there ought to be a book next to the laptop, right? I think that you can learn a lot if you surf online and you look up this and you look up that, and one thing can lead to another. But there's so much junk along the way as well. And I don't think that young people have been taught yet in high school, and they need to be taught it immediately in college, how to distinguish between what it is worthwhile to pursue online, what sources have merit, have substance, are sufficiently important to pay attention to, and what it is that you should just not pay attention to, and where it comes from, and why you should not pay attention, even while opening yourself to letting one thing lead to another. But there is something about the world of the library, of moving from one book to another, of going down a stack and seeing that, gosh, there's another book on this subject that's related, and so on and so forth. There's no educational experience like it. And there is also, I think, in libraries and in the world of libraries and the experience of libraries, the ultimate intellectual freedom that exists anywhere. You can go into a library and read and think what you want. And going online is a different exercise altogether.
I agree, of course, which is why I asked that question.
I'm glad you agree.
And I will say that we had a conference here just this last week on the future, the past, present, and future of libraries, and the people there who ran academic libraries just didn't get it. Absolutely didn't get it at all. Let me ask one other question. As you may have noticed, I've shared my my ideas about what questions to ask with Hanna before we start. But I want to ask you one that I didn't warn you about.
What?
Kissinger.
What?
Kissinger.
Kissinger.
Can you still do that?
Kissinger, Kissinger, of course, is a member of the second generation, and older than I, but not that much older, I would have to say. And Henry Kissinger is someone that I've known for a good part of my life. We lived next door to Henry Kissinger and his first wife when we lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We were all graduate students at the time, but he was a different kind of graduate student because he seemed already to live a bourgeois existence and to be important. And all of us graduate students used to talk about Henry Kissinger because he was just that sort of figure. He was different from the rest of us, and yet was he really any smarter? And did he have any greater right to behave the way he did, and so on and so forth? I would see Henry going out of his apartment next door to ours in the morning. He was already going to Washington to be a consultant or something like that. He would carry a little dispatch case. Behind him would come his wife carrying the suitcases. It was that kind of marriage. So, since I'm not a very serious person, I developed a sort of thing about imitating Henry Kissinger. And this was, somehow part of my graduate school fun and so on and so forth. Years later, the foreign minister of Turkey came to visit me in my office at the University of Chicago. That was scary in itself because when a Turkish foreign minister traveled, everyone worried that Cypriots were about to assassinate him. And so there was all kinds of security around and so on. And this guy was very short, and he sat on my sofa. His feet didn't quite touch the floor. And he leaned forward like this, and he said, "I understand that you do an imitation of Henry Kissinger." He said, "Will you do this for me?" Well, I was aware of all the security that was around, and I didn't want to provoke an international incident. And also, I was kind of annoyed. I think, by the way, it was this gentleman's sister who had been. The Wall Street Journal did an article in which they about me, in which they mentioned this, and they talked to everyone I knew, and I think it was your sister who told him about the Henry Kissinger thing. And the foreign minister immediately lost all interest in me.
So with, I think you would have made an excellent radio comedian. That last question, I think, proved it all to us. But it's time for me to quit and to open the floor to questions in the few minutes that we have left.
You have to shout at me because I'm sort of deaf.
I was wondering how your father.
Sorry.
I was wondering how your father managed with English. I know that many German scientists.
That my father what?
How he managed with English.
How he manages English?
German scientists had a relatively simple time because the language requirements were much less. But as a historian, articulate exposition of historical concepts, I would think must have been quite difficult for him as a new professor at Yale. How did he deal with it?
Well, it's a strange thing because my father was a brilliant student in Germany, but he failed English in the gymnasium. And my mother was a genius at languages, and her accent always remained, but she was interested in language, and so she learned English the way you learn a language. My father went off to London, and he went to Berlitz. And my father, by the way, had a chair in Berlin that was then removed from Berlin that was endowed by the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace. And that meant that he was able in London, because of that connection, to get a desk and some support at the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And so he was surrounded by English speakers, and he simply had to do something. But at the point where he decided he wanted to go to America and look for a job, everyone said this is never going to work because Hayo is never going to learn English properly. He studied when he was on the boat. He got to America. People began to congratulate him on his English. I don't know what they thought German-speaking people might be able to do. And I think it was simply necessity and his own perseverance, that is, if he set his mind he was going to do it. He'd had enough people talk to him about it. He'd been to Berlitz. I don't know how good Berlitz was, but there must have been a good one in London. And he somehow managed. Also, he found, and he was delighted to find, that the students he had at Yale were very nice about it. You know, he was self-conscious, of course, about his English. And he worried that as he lectured to these large classes of students, they would not understand him or they would laugh at him. But they were rather amused by and fond of the accent. And I still find a few very aged like me, in his case students who took his courses at Yale as undergraduates, who think very fondly about that. So I think somehow he encountered people who helped him succeed. And one of the things about a language that you don't know is if you go and people are going to be snooty about your language, you're not going to get anywhere. But if you go to Italy and say a few words in Italian, they love you. And in some way, that makes your Italian better, and you open up and you try it out, and that's fine with them. And I think that's what happened to him.
Way in the back there.
I can't hear, I'm sorry. I'm not sure it's working. I still can't hear.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Given Bryn Mawr's proximity to Philadelphia, do you have any fond or detestable memories connected with the city of Philadelphia?
Given Bryn Mawr's proximity to this city, do you have any particularly fond or detestable memories of Philadelphia?
Thank you. I have very fond memories of several things about Philadelphia. One was the Philadelphia Symphony. Used to come into the city and go to symphony concerts, and they were wonderful. I guess it was Eugene Ormandy at that time. In those days, you could go to the Broad Street station or to 30th Street when you came into Philadelphia. And when you went home, there was this wonderful train call at the station, which I remember very fondly, in which every town on the main line would be mentioned, and you'd go to Bryn Mawr, Rosemont, et cetera, and then finally it would end Paoli and the West. And the sense of the West being there beyond Paoli. I mean, they probably had Harrisburg in mind, God help us. But there was something romantic about the train call of Paoli in the West. And then when you had a date, some young man came down from Princeton. You went into the city to have dinner and dance. That's what we did in those days. You met them at the Bellevue, Stratford. That was where it was thought appropriate for young women to meet their dates. And so I remember that rather fondly as well. And those were the kinds of memories I have that made me rather fond of Philadelphia.
Other question up front here?
It's working now, yes.
Hi, Professor Gray. I was just wondering these days there's so many crises at college campuses that will bring a president down. We've seen this at MSU, USC, Missouri, Rochester, and you were a president for 15 years, and that just doesn't happen anymore. I think was it the president of UT Austin, who had been the man in charge of finding bin Laden, and he said being a college president was the hardest job he'd ever had. So I was just curious, in your presidency, what was the toughest crisis you ever faced?
What was the biggest crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it might be in the book, and I haven't read it yet, but what was the biggest crisis, and you might not even know about because it was something behind the scenes, but.
Well, I mean, there are never enough resources, and when I came to that office at the University of Chicago, this is an alumna we're talking to, the university was not in the best of shape for a whole variety of reasons. But what the university was in very good shape about was a kind of ethos that's been its defining ethos of attention to the central intellectual mission of an institution like that, attention to a certain kind of scholarship and interdisciplinarity in that scholarship, and attention to the major qualities that a first-rate university needs to have in terms of academic freedom, in terms of the freedom, enabling the freedom of each of its members to do the very best that they can do toward the goals that they're aiming for, and so on and so forth. And so in a way, the university was in a sort of crisis at the time that I went there. But I think in terms of episodes of events, the very long issue that wasn't a single event, but it was an issue over a long period of time, and a very absorbing one, was that whether the university endowment should be disinvested from companies that did business in South Africa. A very emotional and difficult issue. And because I took the position that it is not for the university as a corporate entity to take a position, but to be the enabler of freedom in an environment where people make up their own minds rather than there being an official position, that you don't impose that position on people who may have different conclusions, and so on and so forth. That for that reason, as well as for the reasons of what the endowment had in fact been given for, which was for the purposes of education and research and so on, rather than for the purpose of making political statements, important though they could be. And finally, because it seemed to me that it was all very well to declare oneself virtuous, and what would happen if you gave up your shares? Somebody who didn't care about the question of apartheid would buy them, and so on. So I was in favor of adopting what were called the Sullivan Principles, which looked at the quality of policies on the part of those American corporations that were present in South Africa. Namely, were they giving equal opportunities to their employees? Were they giving equal benefits? In other words, were they being subversive within the system, as I think IBM and a number of the other big international corporations were? And would that, in turn, together with the concern of the South African business and other communities, help to put pressure on for the elimination of the system? Now, you can argue that, you know, there are very good positions on both sides, on all sides of this question. And it was sort of tough to be, you know, constantly caricatured as somebody who was supporting apartheid, which was obviously not the point. You did not feel that you were a partisan for that cause, to put it mildly. It was a difficult issue that went on for a very long time. It wasn't a crisis. It was one of those things that had critical moments, where there were protests or this and that and the other. And similarly, there were a few moments of that sort on the kind of issue that comes up over and over again and is talked about a great deal these days. You know, if you have a speaker who is unpopular, can you disinvite a speaker? And very early in my time, I had such a case when Robert McNamara was invited to come and receive an award, which I hadn't even known about. It was my first year. I didn't know that this thing had been established the year before. And to speak, and of course he was the least popular person on any campus, and seen as the great villain of the Vietnam War. And in any case, he was invited, and then all hell broke loose. And I was asked to disinvite him, and said I wouldn't, and didn't. And it was a big cause. And when the night came in which he spoke, there was a student protest, and well, I won't go into the whole story, but in the end, there were police who felt that they had to remove protesters from a city street because they wouldn't get off the street and onto the sidewalks. And of course, that was a very distasteful and not exactly popular time for me. But the one thing that was but you know, all crises have their comic moments too, because the protesters were asked several times by the police commander to get out of University Avenue, remove themselves to the sidewalks or the quadrangle. They could protest. There wasn't a question about whether they should be protesting, but they shouldn't be cluttering up the street. So the third time, he had a megaphone, and he called us out. And at that point, some bystander threw, and there is not unanimity on whether this was a frozen cherry pie or a frozen strawberry cream pie. And it hit the police commander. And that was when the paddy wagons rolled in. And a few of our students were carted off. So there was even a comic moment in that crisis. Although at the time it didn't seem as funny as it seems to be now. So you had those moments too of protest. But protests come and go. And the big thing is to keep talking. And to not just keep talking with protesters, but with the entire community, and make it, if possible, some kind of educational opportunity, and not only a time when you somehow desperately have to tap things down. And, you know, to the degree that we had such moments, I think we all did learn from them. I hope so.
So let's take one more question. Over here.
Professor Gray, may I ask which college did you go to Oxford? The reason I want to ask is that my son just went to Oxford, and given that his choice was between University of Chicago and Oxford, and the reason his criteria is whether to go to Oxford or not is that he applied open. He didn't know which eventual college he would be placed at in Oxford. So I asked it, how would you make decision?
Yeah.
He said he almost, his observation is that any of the previously women colleges, he would not go because there are Siberians among the colleges, and it's too far to the city center. He got a place in a previously all-men college, so he decided to go, to our surprise, which my husband and I, both University of Chicago alumni. So I wish you had this event earlier, so you can help to steer him the other way, or maybe you can also talk a little bit more about, you know, what you would say for American boy choosing a college career between University of Chicago and Oxford.
Well, Oxford's a very different place now. I went to St. Anne's College. I was sent to St. Anne's College. And St. Anne's College is now, like all the other women's colleges, a co-educational institution. St. Anne's College has expanded into a really lovely little campus. It's quite large, much larger than it was when I was there. And it has produced more first degrees where people took first, than most of the other colleges. So it's taken some years, I think, for the formerly all-women's colleges to be seen as having the same prestige as a Magdalen or a Balliol or St. John's or Christ Church or one of those. But it's coming closer. It's coming closer also because I think the demography, even though that is happening slowly, the student population at Oxford is shifting also. So I don't think you have as many young aristocrats who, bring their polo ponies and all that kind of thing along to Oxford, or who spend their afternoons hunting and one thing and another. I mean, the Oxford that I knew was still that kind of university. There were still people going off. These young men, they would give sherry parties and lunches where they'd have a few bottles of wine. Then they'd go out and hunt. It's amazing they didn't shoot people by mistake. And then they'd come back and they'd have a drinks party and dinner, and then they'd go out and smash up some furniture and some pubs and so on and so forth. I'd never seen anything like it. I mean, you think about drunken young students at our institutions. Even Princeton clubs couldn't manage to compete with what I was seeing there at Oxford. And what you were seeing were often highly privileged young men who, lived in a different universe from us girls. St. Anne's College, we didn't have those kinds of things going on. And we had our principal who sometimes allowed us to stay out until 11 o'clock. When I arrived at St. Anne's College, she had us to an evening, the new students. And we sat in a sort of semicircle around her. And she asked each of us a question. And when she came to me, she said, "Is it true that in America you drink tea with ice in it?" And I said, "Yes, this was a quite popular summer drink." She said, "How extraordinary." And that was it. That was my conversation with the principal of my college. Well, Oxford is not like that anymore.
So we've touched on any number of things in Hanna's wonderful memoir, but only scratched the surface. So I highly recommend the whole story to you, and I thank you, Hanna,
Thank you, Bob.
for joining us this evening. This has just been great fun.
Thank you.